Welcome to Late Night Lectures by Night Shift Audio. I'm glad you're here. You don't need to take notes. You don't need to stay awake. Just listen, breathe, and let the information move past you. If you'd like to return for future lectures, you can follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. New episodes are released each Sunday night. Let's begin. In this cozy, hour-long exploration, we'll travel together across time and continents, tracing how societies have carried messages and bound themselves together with networks of communication. This isn't a hurried trip, but a calm wander through stories and milestones, from couriers running along the Nile's banks to airplanes tracing arcs across the sky. Our pace will be measured and mellow. We'll start in the ancient world, move gradually through empires and eras, and arrive in the modern age, all the while maintaining a soothing and informative tone. As we wander through each period, imagine the scenes softly. Weary foot messengers trotting over desert sands, relay horses galloping under starry skies, mail coaches rattling along country lanes at dawn, and early airplanes droning through the clouds with sacks of letters. Each development in postal history not only delivered messages, but also connected people, emperors and subjects, merchants and customers, loved ones separated by distance. So get comfortable. Let's begin our journey in ancient times, where the seeds of global postal systems were first sown. Our story opens over 4,000 years ago, in the sun-baked kingdoms of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Long before emails or even paper, these early civilizations devised ways to send information across surprising distances. In Egypt around 2400 BCE, pharaohs like Djedkare-Sesi established some of the world's earliest known courier networks. Imagine royal messengers running along the Nile and across desert paths, carrying papyrus scrolls bearing the pharaoh's decrees. These resolute runners reportedly traversed the entire length of the kingdom, a journey of several hundred miles, ensuring that even distant provinces heard the pharaoh's voice. It was a feat of organization and endurance that helped bind together the far corners of Egyptian to the northeast in Mesopotamia, the land of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Similar innovations were unfolding. By around 2330 BCE, King Sargon of Akkad and his successors governed a growing empire in which communication was vital. Archaeologists have uncovered clay tablet letters from this era, written in neat lines of cuneiform script, which were transported by trusted couriers. Lacking papyrus, Mesopotamian scribes impressed their messages onto clay tablets, then protected them by enclosing them in clay envelopes, essentially a clay wrapping that could be sealed with a stamp and then broken open by the recipient. One can picture a messenger loading these sturdy tablets into a satchel, then setting off by donkey or on foot between cities like Akkad, and Babylon. These early letters dealt with everything from grain shipments to personal matters, hinting that even in the Bronze Age, people relied on couriers to keep commerce and governance running smoothly. What's remarkable is how these Bronze Age postal methods laid a foundation for future systems. By 2000 BCE, merchants in Assyrian city-states were using couriers to maintain long-distance trade, and letters traveled in caravan convoys between Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Across the ancient Near East, from the cities of Sumer to the courts of Babylon and Egypt, a pattern emerged. Rulers and traders understood that swift communication could hold an empire or a marketplace together. Although these early postal services were limited to the elite and officialdom, they demonstrated the timeless need to bridge distances with information. Gently, the idea of an organized message relay system was taking root. As we leave ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, we can reflect on how impressive these achievements were. In an era without the technologies we take for granted today, leaders created networks of messengers that spanned hundreds of miles. Messages that once would have taken months to arrive could now reach their destination in a matter of days or weeks. It was only the beginning. Next, we travel east and then west to see how other great empires in Persia, China, and Rome built upon these early innovations and forwarded in time to the 6th century BCE. We come to the vast Achaemenid Empire of Persia. Here, the art of long-distance messaging reached a new level of sophistication and speed. The Persian realm stretched from the Aegean Sea all the way to the Indus Valley, thousands of miles of mountains, deserts, and plains. How could an emperor like Darius the Great keep in touch with such far-flung provinces? The answer was an ingenious relay network of roads and way stations known as the Chapar Khane. Persia's Great Royal Road was the empire's main artery, running about 2,700 kilometers from Sardis in the west to Susa in the east. Along this route, Darius first established post stations at regular intervals, roughly a day's ride apart. These stations, the Chapar Khane, were more than mere horse stables. They were well-stocked rest stops where a fresh horse and rider could take over the mail from an incoming courier and dash off to the next station without delay. By swapping riders and mounts in this manner, the Persians achieved breathtaking speeds for the era. A message could traverse the entire royal road in about 9 days, a journey that would have taken almost 3 months on foot. To put it gently, this was the express delivery of antiquity. Greek observers were astonished. The historian Herodotus paid tribute to the Persian courier's dedication and speed, writing, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Those words, etched in antiquity, ring so familiar that they now adorn modern post office buildings, a testament to how legendary the Persian system fets. Persian courier, known as the Ongaros to the Greeks, was a hardy and trusted rider. We can imagine him galloping across the arid Iranian plateau, pausing only minutes at a chaparkhane to hand off his parcel of scrolls or tablets to the next horseman, perhaps snatching a cup of water before the relay continues. In each relay post, supplies and shelter awaited. A fresh horse, provisions, maybe a fire at night, all maintained by the imperial administration. This was a lifeline of information for the empire. Through it, the great king in Persepolis or Susa could swiftly send orders to distant satraps and receive news in return. An attempted rebellion on the Egyptian frontier, a crop failure in Mesopotamia, a threat at the Greek border, all these reports could speed toward the capital at a pace unheard of in earlier times. Underneath the stars and scorching sun, these Persian messengers knit the empire together. The network was so effective that later empires sought to emulate it. One historian notes that Darius's network of roads and relay stations essentially laid the groundwork for the superb road system the Romans later built across their empire. For now, having marveled at Persia's relay riders, let's gently shift our gaze even further east, to another ancient land where a sophisticated postal system was blossoming, one that would endure for millennia. Our journey now takes us to ancient China, where as early as 3,000 years ago, we find the emergence of an organized courier network. Under the Zhou dynasty, officials known as Xingfu were tasked with carrying government orders and military dispatches across the kingdom. This marks one of the oldest known postal services in the world, parallel to those in Egypt and Persia. Picture an imperial courier in Zhou-era China, perhaps dressed in a simple tunic, bearing a folded silk or bamboo slip with written orders, and riding swiftly out from the capital to provincial lords. These couriers and the system supporting them were crucial to maintaining the mandate of heaven, the emperor's authority across distant lands. As Chinese civilization grew and unified, its postal institutions became more structured. By the Qin dynasty, which unified China after centuries of warring states, a standardized relay system was in place for official correspondence. The very word for post, yu, dates from this era, when the Qin standardized postal station names across the land. Couriers carried bamboo slip messages or silk letters along imperial highways, transferring them from station to station, much like the Persians did. Indeed, one of the founders of the Han dynasty, Liu Bang, is said to have started out as a head of a postal station, illustrating how integral these communication lines were to the empire's functioning. Throughout the Han dynasty and in later dynasties like the Tang, the courier network expanded in reach and efficiency. By the Tang dynasty, the postal system had grown to an impressive scale. Records speak of 1,600 or more post stations scattered across China, linked by footpaths, horse trails, and even canals for water transport. Some 20% of these Tang-era post stations were for water routes, thanks to the Grand Canal that allowed faster north-south shipments. Couriers could thus travel by boat where feasible, or gallop on horseback where roads allowed, ensuring that the imperial court in Chang'an remained informed about even the farthest provinces. A famous story from the Tang tells of Emperor Xuanzong having his couriers deliver fresh lychee fruits from South China to please his favorite consort in the capital. A journey of many hundreds of miles accomplished so fast that the delicate fruit arrived still sweet and unspoiled. Whether legend or truth, the tale highlights the awe people felt at the courier system's important tray. To note that in China, as in other ancient empires, these services were originally limited to the state's use. Ordinary people could not simply send letters via the imperial post in those days. Civilian communication relied on finding a traveling acquaintance or hiring a private runner, a far less reliable method, as many a lost letter in history can attest. Nonetheless, over centuries, the idea of a postal relay network became deeply ingrained in Chinese governance. Dynasties rose and fell, but each maintained some form of courier system, recognizing it as essential infrastructure for a vast empire. We have now seen how three ancient civilizations, Egypt, Persia, and China, each developed ways to move information with surprising speed for their time. They did it independently, yet all hit upon similar solutions: relay stations, official couriers, and state oversight to ensure reliability. Before moving on, it's worth a gentle pause to acknowledge that the desire to communicate across distance is universal. Even across the oceans, in the pre-Columbian Americas, great cultures devised their own postal innovations. The Inca Empire in the Andes, for example, maintained relay runners who would sprint between mountaintop stations, carrying messages encoded in knotted cords and fresh produce or fish for the emperor, meaning a fish from the Pacific coast could reach the Inca capital high in the mountains, still fresh. And the Maya civilization likely operated a similar foot messenger system for over 1,000 years. These parallels remind us that wherever humanity built roads and paths, we also built ways to send news along as our historical journey continues. We leave the ancient world and enter the era after the great classical empires. With the fall of Rome in the West, we'll see how postal systems flickered, adapted, and later reemerged in new forms. But before that, we must visit one more sprawling empire of the past, one that, in the 13th century, created perhaps the fastest communication network the pre-modern world had ever, is now the 1200 CE, and the Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan and his successors, has exploded across Eurasia, from China and Korea all the way to the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The Mongols, famed as fierce conquerors, were all surprisingly adept at administration. To govern their enormous dominion and ensure military orders traveled swiftly, they established a remarkable postal relay system known as the Yam. This system in many ways resembled the earlier Persian and Chinese relay posts, but on an even grander, more intensive scale. Under Ogedei Khan, the Yam network was expanded and meticulously organized. Imagine a vast lattice of routes crisscrossing the steppes and mountains, with relay stations positioned roughly every 20 to 40 miles along the way. At each station, fresh horses were kept in readiness, and supplies like food and shelter awaited the couriers. A messenger would arrive at a station, perhaps exhausted and windswept, and promptly pass his dispatch to a new rider who leapt onto a fresh horse and continued the journey without pause. Meanwhile, the first rider could rest for the next leg or return with replies. In this leapfrogging fashion, messages were always efficiency was unparalleled. Contemporary accounts reported that Mongol couriers could cover an astonishing 200 to 300 kilometers in a single day by these relays. Remember, this is long before trains or telegraphs. It was human and animal endurance pushed to its peak. The Mongol Yam enabled the great Khans to send decrees across continents with incredible speed for the era. For example, a message could travel from Karakorum to the edges of Europe in just a few weeks, a distance that might have taken many months by ordinary means. European travelers who visited Mongol domains were amazed by the Yam system and wrote about it in detail. The Venetian explorer Marco Polo, among others, described how the Khan's couriers, wearing special belts to signify their authority, would ride at a gallop and could requisition horses at post stations along the road. He noted that there were tens of thousands of horses kept ready across the empire for messenger service, a postal army of sorts. These accounts almost sound like something from a fairy tale. A letter marked with the great Khan's seal, speeding across the Silk Roads faster than anyone thought possible. But it was very real, and it helped keep a diverse empire tightly knit. Orders, intelligence reports, and trade news flowed through this network, enhancing the Mongols' control and also facilitating cultural and commercial exchange across Eurasia. It's worth noting that the Mongol postal system did not vanish with the end of Mongol rule. In some regions, it left lasting influence. For instance, parts of the yam system were preserved in subsequent eras. Medieval Russia, for example, continued a relay post tradition inherited from the Mongols into the 15th century. The Mongols, by adopting ideas from the Chinese and Persian systems and amplifying them, set a standard for speed that wouldn't be exceeded until the modern, having toured the expansive networks of antiquity and the Middle Ages. From Rome to China to the Mongols, we return to medieval Europe, where for a time the art of long-distance mail had to be rediscovered and reinvented on a smaller scale. In the next section, we will see how Europe transitioned from the chaos after Rome's fall to new means of carrying letters, often driven by merchants and universities, until eventually nation-states took on the challenge of delivering mail to the public. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century CE, its magnificent cursus publicus postal system crumbled too. Gone were the legions of official couriers maintaining regular routes across Europe. In these early medieval centuries, strong centralized governments were rare, and so were large-scale postal services. Yet the need to communicate did not disappear. Instead, it was met in piecemeal ways. Kings, nobles, and bishops maintained their own small corps of messengers to send orders to vassals or letters to allies. Monasteries and the Catholic Church, spanning many regions, also had envoys carrying correspondence between abbeys and bishops. Still, for the average person, or even a minor lord, sending a message across medieval Europe was a hit-or-miss affair. Often, a letter would be entrusted to a traveling merchant or a pilgrim heading in the right direction. Essentially, one hoped for the kindness of a courier by happenstance. By the High Middle Ages, however, as trade and education grew, more organized systems emerged out of practical necessity. Merchant guilds and universities became unlikely pioneers of mail delivery. Many guilds of traders or craftsmen began to arrange regular messenger services to support their businesses. A famous example was the Butchers' Guild in medieval Germany, which set up the so-called Metzger post. Because butchers frequently traveled to buy and sell cattle, they started carrying letters for others along their routes. Over time, this ad hoc courier service became surprisingly reliable and well-known, essentially an early private mail line piggybacking on the trade in Italian merchant companies in the 13th century organized postal links between their far-flung commercial centers. Wealthy trading families in Florence, Venice, or Genoa needed to stay in touch with agents and markets in other cities. They hired couriers or used trusted servants to run messages on a schedule. Notably, starting in the mid-1200s, Italian merchants maintained regular postal connections with the Champagne fairs in France. These fairs were big international marketplaces held a few times a year. Italian couriers would depart on fixed dates to arrive in Champagne in time for the fair, carrying orders and information one way, and then return carrying contracts and payments the other way. The routes, timetables, and even fees for this service were carefully regulated, as recorded in ledgers. In effect, these traders created one of Europe's first international mail routes, privately run, but benefiting anyone who could pay the fee. Because merchants from all over Europe met at Champagne, the Italian courier system became an exchange point for letters between many regions. Other institutions also wove their own postal webs. The University of Paris, for example, had grown into such a major center of learning by the late Middle Ages that it set up its own mail service for the scholarly community. Professors and students needed books, documents, and correspondence from other centers of learning, and an official university courier helped meet that need. In the cities and courts of medieval Europe, a patchwork of private couriers, city messengers, and merchant post riders gradually filled the void. By the 1400s, if you were in, say, the Hanseatic port of Lübeck and needed to send a letter to London, you might entrust it to a Hanseatic merchant ship heading west, or wait for a Hanse courier. The Hanseatic League merchants did operate relay messengers between their member cities as well. It wasn't fast or uniform, but things were improving. We should note, too, the influence of the Islamic caliphates and the Ottoman Empire at this time. From the 7th century onward, the Islamic world maintained a system called the barid, with mounted couriers and post houses reminiscent of the older Persian model. Baghdad in the Abbasid era had a thriving relay post that carried news across the Arab Islamic realms. And later, the Ottomans continued this tradition well into the early modern period. So, in different parts of the world during the medieval era, the idea of a state messenger system lived on, fragmented in Europe, more continuous in the Middle East and Asia. As we near the end of the Middle Ages, the stage is set for a significant change. The printing press appears around 1450, literacy slowly rises, and European kingdoms begin to centralize power. All these trends mean more letters, more demand for communication, and more incentive for rulers to control postal routes. We are gently transitioning out of the medieval world of isolated courier networks into the early modern era, where national postal services are about to be the dawn of the 16th century, and strong centralized states are emerging in Europe. Kings and queens now rule over larger, more unified domains, France, Spain, England, and others, and they need efficient ways to govern them. At the same time, more and more people are writing letters, thanks to wider literacy and the spread of printed news. Into this changing world comes a famous postal dynasty and the seeds of state-run mail. One pivotal player was the Thurnun-Taxis family. They began in the 15th century by operating postal couriers in the service of the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperors. By the early 1500s, Thurnun-Taxis couriers were running an extensive network linking the Habsburg lands, from Austria and Germany down to Italy and across to the Spanish Netherlands. Their system used relay stations and some 20,000 couriers to cover most of Europe, a private enterprise that was remarkably efficient and profitable. In a way, Thurnun-Taxis created Europe's first transnational postal service, available to those who could pay. They carried both official and private letters, and their name became synonymous with reliable mail. The remnants of their network lasted all the way until 1867 in parts of Germany, showing how enduring their postal enterprise was. However, the rise of nation-states gradually overtook such private networks. Ambitious monarchs realized that controlling the mail could mean both better governance and a source of revenue. One by one, countries established their own state postal systems in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. In France, King Louis V set up a royal postal service as early as 1477, reportedly employing some 230 mounted couriers on key roads. This French royal post was initially intended for government business only, linking the king with provincial governors and military officers. But even limited to official use, its regularity attracted unofficial mail. In England, King Henry VIII appointed a master of the posts in 1516 to oversee mail routes radiating out from London. Again, the service was primarily to carry royal dispatches along the major roads. Ordinary people were not the focus of these early state postal routes, and indeed, at first, they were not allowed to use them. Yet demand has a way of asserting itself. Despite rules to the contrary, private letters did find their way onto these royal postal lines, often by bribing riders or piggybacking on official couriers. In France, after some futile attempts to crack down, the crown eventually legalized the carrying of private mail around 1600, realizing it could charge fees and make money by doing so. This was a turning point. The postal service was becoming a public service, not just a royal privilege. By 1627, France had formal postal rates and timetables, and post offices were established in major cities. Likewise, in England, King Charles I made the Royal Mail Service available to the public in 1635 for a fee, with a proclaimed goal of improving communication across the kingdom. A man named Thomas Witherings was tasked with organizing regular mail coaches that would run night and day along the main roads from London, setting a schedule that subjects could rely on. These early national postal services were not yet uniform or monopolistic in the modern sense. Private courier companies, city posts, and university mail systems still operated alongside them. But over the next few decades, governments moved to assert monopoly control. England's postal system, for instance, formally became a state monopoly. Private post carriers on main routes were suppressed by law by the late 17th century. In France, a royal edict in 1672 declared all postal services to be the exclusive right of the state, and independent postal entrepreneurs were gradually bought out or shut down. Even the venerable University of Paris, which had held postal privileges for centuries, was forced to relinquish its mail service in 1719 in exchange for compensation. The era of free-for-all mail carriage was ending, and the era of centralized postal administrations had arrived. However, just because the state had a monopoly did not mean it met all needs immediately. There was still room for innovation to serve growing cities, and here we see one of the charming episodes of postal history, the creation of local penny posts. In London, in 1680, a forward-thinking entrepreneur named William Dockwra started the London penny post. For the price of 1 penny, he offered to pick up and deliver letters within the city of London, an early example of urban mail delivery. Dockwra introduced several concepts that were ahead of their time. Letters had to be prepaid, and his clerks would mark each letter with a hand stamp noting the time and place it was posted. He even managed to deliver letters within London up to several times a day, almost hourly in busy areas, using teams of foot postmen. Londoners loved the service. It was fast and cheap. Unfortunately for Dockwra, it was also an infringement on the government's monopoly. The successful penny post was shut down by authorities in 1682 and absorbed into the official General Post Office, though Dockwra's methods proved their value and were later adopted by the state. A similar story played out in Paris, where a local penny post for city mail started in 1759 and was quickly co-opted into the French royal mail system. By the 18th century, most European countries and their colonies abroad had postal systems recognizable as such. They involved scheduled dispatches of mail coaches or riders, post offices where letters could be left and collected, and postage fees based on distance and weight. The reliability was improving steadily. In Britain, the post office introduced mail stagecoaches in 1784, replacing slower single-post riders. These stagecoaches, operating on improved roads, could average 8 to 10 miles per hour, making overnight delivery of letters possible over 100 miles from London. This was a significant jump in speed and consistency. By the early 1800s, a letter posted in London might reach Edinburgh in as little as 2 days, a journey that would have taken a week or more in earlier times. Similarly, across the Atlantic, the newly independent United States was rapidly expanding its postal network, from just 75 post offices in 1789 to over 8,000 post offices by 1830, as settlers moved westward. Postal service was seen as so important to the young U.S. that it was one of the few government functions explicitly authorized in the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin, as the first Postmaster General, had already laid the groundwork by surveying post roads and standardizing delivery in the colonies earlier in the 18th century. So by the early 19th century, postal systems were flourishing in many parts of the world. Yet, despite all this progress, sending a letter could still be costly for the average person, especially if it had to go far. Postal fees were often charged per mile of travel and per sheet of paper, making long-distance correspondence a luxury. This is where the next chapter of our story brings perhaps the most famous innovation of all, the postage stamp, and the revolution of affordable mail. Until the mid-19th century, mailing a letter was often a burden on the recipient. Literally. In many systems, it was the person receiving the letter who had to pay the postage due, which could be quite high if the letter traveled far or was heavy. It sounds strange today, but imagine dreading a letter because you'd have to pay for it upon arrival. Moreover, postal rates were complex, with clerks calculating fees based on distance and number of pages, and sometimes even charging more if a letter crossed into another country's system. All this complexity kept letter writing out of reach for poorer folk and made postal services less efficient than they could be. Enter Sir Rowland Hill, a British educator and reformer with a mind for efficiency. In 1837, Rowland Hill published a groundbreaking pamphlet called Post Office Reform, Its Importance and Practicability. In it, he analyzed the costs of the British Post Office and made a bold proposal: simplify everything. Hill discovered that the actual cost of transporting a letter was very low, regardless of distance. Most of the expense was in handling and administration. So why not charge a uniform low rate for all letters anywhere in the country? And why not require that postage be paid in advance by the sender to eliminate the cumbersome task of collecting money on delivery? To make prepayment easy, Hill suggested a novel idea: a small piece of paper that could be purchased and affixed to a letter as proof of payment, what he called an adhesive stamp. Though Hill's ideas initially met resistance from officials, the public loved the prospect of cheaper mail. A wave of popular support in England led to the adoption of Hill's reforms. In 1840, the world's first postage stamp was issued, the famed penny black, showing Queen Victoria's profile, which cost 1 penny and could send a letter anywhere in Britain up to half an ounce in weight. Alongside it, the uniform penny post was inaugurated. A flat rate of 1 penny per letter, regardless of distance within the country. The effect was electric. Suddenly, ordinary people could afford to correspond regularly. The number of letters sent in Britain exploded in the years after 1840, going from tens of millions to hundreds of millions annually as the century progressed. Hill's reforms brought the post within the means of the mass of the people, as one history notes, and also streamlined the postal system's operations immensely. No more haggling over payments at the door, no more calculating complicated routes. Just a simple prepaid letter dropped in a pillar box. Other countries watched and quickly followed suit. Switzerland and Brazil were among the first to adopt postage stamps and uniform rates in the 1840s, and by the 1850s, stamps were spreading worldwide. The United States, for instance, introduced its first postage stamps in 1847. By the 1860s, stamped envelopes or adhesive stamps became the norm for mail virtually everywhere. It's hard to overstate how much this philatelic innovation changed everyday life. Personal mail, business mail, newspapers by mail, all flourished. The stamp also gave rise to a new hobby, but that's another story. We should also mention that Rowland Hill wasn't the first to think of a penny post concept. As we saw, London had a penny post in 1680, and parts of the American colonies had local penny post services in the early 1800s. But Hill's achievement was in reforming an entire national system and introducing the adhesive postage stamp as the key instrument. For this, he was knighted and is remembered as the father of modern postal service. With postage reforms in place, postal volumes kept climbing. Post offices grew into major institutions in every country. By the mid-19th century, one could send a letter from, say, London to New York with relative ease. You'd pay your local postage, and thanks to arrangements between national postal services, the letter would make its way across the ocean and be delivered at the other end. Yet those international arrangements were getting complicated. This brings us to the next key development. As mail truly went global in the 19th century, there arose a need to coordinate the world's postal systems, and thus was born the idea of an international postal force. We discussed the International Union. Let's set the scene of mid-19th century technology, because it dramatically affected how mail traveled. The Industrial Revolution brought new modes of transport that shrank distances like never before. Railroads began crisscrossing countries in the 1830s and 1840s, offering unprecedented speed and reliability over land. No longer limited to the pace of a horse, mail could be loaded onto trains and whisked across hundreds of miles in hours. Postal administrations were quick to take advantage. Britain established the first traveling railway post offices in 1838, where mail was actually sorted on board the train as it sped along. By century's end, many nations had vast networks of these mail-sorting train cars, ensuring that letters were organized en route and delivered promptly upon arrival. A letter that once took days by stagecoach could now reach in a fraction of the time. For example, by the 1860s, a letter could go from New York to Chicago in just 2 days by rail, a journey that would have been over 2 weeks by horse earlier on the seas. The advent of the steamship similarly revolutionized international mail. In the era of sailing ships, transoceanic mail was slow and subject to the whims of wind and weather. A letter from Europe to India or Australia traveled at the mercy of the monsoon winds around the Cape of Good Hope, often taking 3 to 6 months one way. But in the 1840s, steam-powered ships and newly opened routes began to cut those times drastically. For instance, the British began a regular steamer mail service to India via Egypt. Steamships would go from England to Egypt, mail would be ferried overland or via the Nile, then another steamer from the Red Sea to India. This cut the transit time to maybe 6 to 8 weeks. By 1869, the Suez Canal was opened, allowing steamships to travel directly from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, which further shortened the Europe-India mail route. The British designated certain ships as RMS in 1840, marking them as contracted carriers of mail, a prestigious status indicating speed and reliability. The famous Cunard Line, for example, began running steamers like the Britannia across the Atlantic on a fixed schedule, carrying mail and passengers. An Atlantic crossing that once took 6 weeks under sail could be done in 10 to 14 days by the United States. Westward expansion led to some legendary mail exploits. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, when Gold Rush California was booming, there was the short-lived but romantic Pony Express in 1860-61. A relay of daring young riders on horseback who raced from Missouri to California in just 10 days, flying across prairies, desert, and mountains with mail pouches. It was extremely costly and lasted only 18 months, but it demonstrated the lengths to which people would go to speed up mail delivery. In a sense, the Pony Express was the American echo of the Mongol Yam, a chain of riders and horses covering huge distances at breakneck speed. However, even as these physical transports shrank the world, an even faster mode of communication emerged, the electric telegraph. In 1844, Samuel Morse sent the first long-distance telegraph message in the U.S., and soon telegraph wires were spreading like a metallic web across countries and continents. By the late 1850s, Europe and North America were crisscrossed with telegraph lines, and in 1866, the first reliable transatlantic telegraph cable was laid, allowing a message to go from London to New York in minutes, not weeks. Telegraphy was often run by separate companies or government departments. Suddenly, for urgent news, the mail was too slow. One would send a telegram. The telegraph annihilated distance, as people said, and it had major implications for postal services. Routine personal and business correspondence still went by mail, but stock prices, war news, and other time-sensitive communications moved to the response. Postal services adapted. Many post offices became telegraph offices too, and postal networks integrated telegraphy into their operations. Governments negotiated international telegraph treaties just as they did for mail. In fact, an International Telegraph Union was established in 1865, a precursor to the global cooperation we will see with postal services. The world was growing more connected and more complex, and it became clear that for the global postal system to function smoothly, nations needed to work together. So let's set the scene. By 1870, a person could theoretically send a letter from virtually any city in the world to any other, thanks to national postal systems, steamships, and railroads. But the process was cumbersome. Each country had its own rates and rules. Sending a letter abroad often meant buying postage for each country en route or relying on complex reciprocal arrangements. For example, a letter from the United States to France might have had to go via Britain, and each leg might require separate postage or agreements. Postal clerks needed to be minor diplomats to figure out correct routing and payment for international mail. Clearly, a more unified approach was needed. It's time to gather in Switzerland for one of the 19th century's great achievements in international cooperation, the founding of the Universal Postal Union. One postal world, the Universal Postal Union, in 1874, representatives of 22 nations met in the city of Bern, Switzerland, with a mission to simplify and unify the world's postal services. This meeting, convened at the urging of Heinrich von Stefan, resulted in the Treaty of Bern, a document that fundamentally changed international mail. The treaty created the General Postal Union, which a few years later was renamed the Universal Postal Union. Essentially, the UPU turned the globe into a single postal territory for exchanging mail. What did this mean in practice? First, the UPU standardized rates and rules for international mail. The delegates agreed on a uniform flat rate to mail a basic letter anywhere in the world. No longer would you pay different postage depending on which route or country the letter went through. One stamp would suffice to get it to its destination. To enable that, the treaty stipulated that all member countries would treat inbound foreign mail as if it were their own mail in terms of service. They would deliver it without extra charges on delivery, and they would accept each other's postage. Each country kept the postage it collected on outbound international letters, even for delivery far away. Balancing out the costs in the U-equary was revolutionary. It meant, for example, that an American could drop a letter to France in a U.S. mailbox with a simple U.S. international stamp and trust that it would be carried across borders and delivered in France without the need for French stamps or complex fees en route. It was no longer necessary to affix postage stamps of countries that a mail piece passed through in transit, as one history notes. A UPU member's stamp became good for the entire journey. The world's postal systems, while still operated by each nation, started behaving like one big integrated UPU, began with mostly European and North American members, but it expanded rapidly. Within a decade, most of the civilized world had joined. By 1914, almost every independent country was in the Union. Even countries that were not yet members often followed the UPU conventions by arrangement, so global coverage was achieved. Over time, the UPU also became a forum to standardize things like reply coupons, parcel post, and money orders between countries. It is no exaggeration to say that the UPU was one of the earliest and most successful international organizations. It made possible the dependable worldwide mail service that we now take for granted. In recognition of its importance, the UPU later became a specialized agency of the United Nations in 1948, and we still celebrate World Post Day on October 9th, the anniversary of the 1874 Berne Treaty. One lovely symbol of the UPU stands in Berne, a monument unveiled in 1909 depicting 5 allegorical figures passing letters to one another around the globe. It captures the spirit of a world united by communication. Thanks to the UPU, a person in one corner of the globe could send a letter to someone in another remote corner, with confidence that it would arrive. In a gentle, profound way, the UPU shrank the world even further, perhaps not in minutes like the telegraph, but in maintaining that personal human touch of a written message delivered by hand. With the institutional foundations laid, our story enters the 20th century. The last major piece of the global postal puzzle was transportation in the age of flight. We've gone from runners to horses to steam trains and ships. Now we'll take to the skies and see how airmail came into being. And finally, how modern postal services have evolved in the present. Mail coaches to airmail, taking to the skies. In the late 19th century, a few adventurous souls experimented with delivering mail by air, though not by airplanes at first, but by balloons. During the siege of Paris in 1870, for instance, when the city was surrounded during the Franco-Prussian War, Parisians famously sent mail via hot air balloons launched over the enemy lines. These balloon posts carried messages out of the city. While romantic, balloons were at the mercy of the wind. Aside from siege conditions and some novelty flights, they weren't a practical, everyday solution. It wasn't until the early 20th century, with the invention of the airplane, that airmail really took off. The first known official airmail flight took place in 1911 in Britain. A small plane flew from Hendon to Windsor, carrying a sack of mail to celebrate the coronation of King George V. Around the same time, in 1911, there were also demonstration flights in India carrying mail a short distance. These stunts showed that airplanes could carry letters faster than trains, even if the early planes were flimsy and could only carry a little weight. Regular scheduled airmail service came a few years later. In the United States, the post office began an official airmail route in 1918, flying between Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York, initially using Army pilots and biplanes navigating by rivers and landmarks below. Those first U.S. airmail pilots flew in open cockpit planes with no instruments, often risking life and limb for the mail. As aircraft technology improved, the service expanded westward. By 1920, there was a transcontinental airmail route which combined planes by day and trains by night. By 1924, with better planes and the aid of lighted airfields at night, continuous airmail flight across the continent became a reality, cutting coast-to-coast mail time. Europe, the first regular international airmail connection started in 1919 between London and Paris, barely a year after World War I ended. Soon, many European countries had internal airmail routes and links between their capitals. The 1920s saw rapid progress. Airlines sprung up, often subsidized by governments to carry mail as well as passengers. On long-distance routes, especially across the vast British, French, and other empires, airmail proved transformative. For example, Britain pioneered an airmail route to its colonies in East Africa and Asia. By 1929, you could send a letter from London to India entirely by air, a journey taking only days, where by sea it was several weeks. By 1934, this network extended all the way to Australia, as Imperial Airways joined with Qantas in Australia to create a through airmail service from England to the Antipodes. Imagine, a letter posted in London could reach Sydney in perhaps 12 to 14 days. Astonishing at the time. Similarly, in 1933, France established an airmail route stretching from Europe down through West Africa and across the South Atlantic to Brazil, and then onward to Santiago, Chile, achieving near global reach for French airmail. One of the last great frontiers was the North Atlantic. In 1939, the American Yankee Clipper, a Pan American Airways flying boat, inaugurated regular airmail service between New York and Britain. Those big seaplanes hopped from Newfoundland to Ireland in about 24 hours of flight time, a marvel before land-based long-range planes took over. With that, on the eve of World War II, every inhabited continent was linked by airmail. Travel was costly, so early airmail was an expensive premium service. One would pay extra postage to get the faster air service. Some letters were labeled with blue airmail stickers or had special airmail stamps. Yet even at high cost, the demand was strong for urgent correspondence. The advantage in speed was undeniable. What took weeks by ship took days by plane. During World War II, the concept of the lightweight blue aerogram was introduced, a single sheet of thin paper that folded into its own envelope, designed to be sent by airmail using minimal weight. Aerograms became a popular, inexpensive way to send international letters by air for decades thereafter, especially for personal correspondence. After the war, as airplanes grew larger, faster, and more economical, the distinction between airmail and surface mail began to blur. By the 1970s, many countries adopted policies of sending most ordinary international mail by air, even at regular postage rates, simply because it was efficient to do so. The Universal Postal Union encouraged this trend in the 1960s as jet airliners made air transport of mail routine. They even created a concept of surface air lifted mail, mail that would be flown when space was available at little or no surcharge. Nowadays, practically all international mail travels by air. The drama of the early airmail pioneers has faded into everyday normality. We pop a letter in the postbox and maybe don't even realize it will cross oceans on a Boeing 747 or Airbus while we sleep. While transportation took to the skies, postal systems on the ground kept evolving too. In the mid-20th century, many countries introduced postal codes to help sort mail faster and more accurately. Automatic sorting machines and address reading technology were developed to handle the ever-growing volumes of mail in large cities. In short, the postal service became more high-tech behind the scenes, even as the basic act of delivering an envelope door-to-door remained a very human endeavor. Modern postal services and reflections. As we bring our journey to a close, we find ourselves in the present day, a world of instant digital communication, yet one where physical mail still plays an essential role. The late 20th and early 21st centuries introduced new challenges and opportunities for postal systems. On one hand, electronic mail and the internet provided alternatives to sending paper letters, dramatically reducing personal letter volumes. The charming practice of writing long letters to friends or family, once a cornerstone of postal business, has waned in favor of phone calls, emails, and text messages. Many postal administrations saw declines in traditional letter mail by the end of the 20th century, something unimaginable in the heyday of the penny post. Yet, mail has not died. It has adapted. In fact, in some ways, the postal mission has shifted back to its roots in carrying tangible goods. The rise of online shopping and e-commerce means that postal services now handle billions of packages and parcels, items that, unlike a message, cannot be transmitted electronically. Postal trucks today are often filled with goods ordered on the internet, from books to electronics to clothing, destined for doorsteps. The humble parcel post, which started in many countries in the late 19th century, has become a dominant function of modern post offices. Modern postal services have also embraced technology for efficiency and customer service. Tracking numbers allow senders and recipients to follow a package's journey in real time. Automation sorts mail at lightning speed, and postal workers often use handheld computers as they deliver to confirm deliveries or get route guidance. Some postal operators have experimented with drones or self-driving vehicles for delivery in remote or congested areas, echoing those first airmail experiments, but with 21st century also heartening to note that the core values of postal systems remain: universality, reliability, and connecting people. Many countries still consider the postal service a public service that must reach every citizen, whether they live in a crowded city block or on a distant rural farm. The sight of a mail carrier making rounds each day, placing envelopes in the mailbox, is a reassuring routine in communities worldwide. To give a sense of scale, postal networks are among the largest physical distribution networks on Earth. Postal workers deliver to hundreds of millions of addresses daily. The Universal Postal Union, which started with 22 nations, now has 192 member countries, virtually every country, each committing to the principle of allowing mail to flow freely and fairly. Through wars, natural disasters, and social changes, postal services have adapted but never ceased. Even in the digital age, they find purpose. Sometimes in unexpected ways, like delivering medicines, facilitating banking services in rural areas, or providing a trusted identity verification service. And when the internet seems too impersonal, the Postal Service is there to carry that handwritten birthday card or a care package to a loved one far away, delivering a moment of tangible connection. As we wrap up this journey through time, let's take a moment to appreciate the sweep of it all. We began with runners bearing pharaohs, edicts on papyrus, and ended with global logistics moving packages by land, sea, and air. In between, we rode with Persian horsemen, Roman couriers, and Mongol riders. We waited for the mail coach at a coaching inn in Georgian England. We watched a steam locomotive thunder by with a mail car lantern glowing in the night. We flew above the clouds with early aviators guiding their planes by moonlight and compass, sacks of letters in the hold. The methods changed, but the mission to connect people across distance remained. Perhaps, as you listen to this gentle narrative, you'll think differently about the next piece of mail you send or receive. It arrives quietly in your box, but behind it lies a vast history and an army of individuals, past and present, who carried it through their dedication. The global postal system is really a tapestry of countless journeys, large and small, woven over centuries. It's quite a comforting thought. Long before us and long after us, humans will find ways to reach out to each other, no matter how far, with a message or a token of care. That concludes tonight's lecture. If you're still awake, thank you for spending this time here. If you drifted off somewhere along the way, that's exactly as it should be. New lectures are released each Sunday night. Until next time, rest well.